Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first event of the academic year at the Humanities Research Center. My name is Christina Stanton. I'm an associate professor of English here and the director of the Humanities Research Center. And for all their help behind the scenes for this event and many others, I'd like to thank especially Rani Sisavat, our outstanding administrative and communications assistant at the HRC, as well as all the CHF staff members who support our events. Arda Atman is also here with us. Many thanks also to our Dean, Catherine Gracia, and the VP for Research and Innovation at VCU for continuing to support the important work of the humanities at VCU through this center and events like this. For those of you who are new to this series, our speaker series events usually follow a similar format. I will briefly introduce our guest, who then will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And in the meantime, you can use the Q&A function on the screen to post your questions, and we'll address them in the order in which we receive them. Tonight's talk is part of a new speaker series at the HRC this year on environmental humanities. And this series complements a new lab in environmental humanities we launched earlier this year at the HRC and directed by our colleague in sociology and the associate director of the HRC, Dr. Jessie Goldstein, as well as a new cohort of faculty fellows at the center this year, working on projects ranging from topics such as cave conservation and animal studies, vanadium mining, toxic legacies and extractive colonialism, to global relocation in the Anthropocene and the ecological materialities of artificial intelligence in the racial capitalocene. I hope I said that right. My colleague Jenny Ree in English is working on this. Jenny, I apologize if I mispronounced it. Our speaker series this year centers humanistic inquiry to understand, interpret, and shape broader efforts to address this most pressing challenge of our time. The broad field of environmental humanities helps fill an important gap in sustainability and environmental thinking, bringing fresh perspectives and a deep ethical commitment to weaving equity and justice into all climate change conversations. I'm very thrilled to welcome to the Humanities Research Center tonight, Professor Stephanie Foote, who is the Jackson and Nichols Professor of English at West Virginia University, and who was my teacher in grad school many, many years ago. I won't say how many. I met Stephanie 2 decades ago, I did say it, at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she was at the time the rising star in US literature and culture, particularly 19th century American literature and theory. And Stephanie's work crosses many boundaries for those of you who know her work, from genre studies, particularly the novel, to the relationship between new and historical materialisms, the history of the book, and in the last decade, over a decade, environmental humanities. She's the author of monographs such as Regional Fictions, Culture and Identity in 19th Century American Literature, The Parvenu's Plot, Gender, Culture and Class in the Age of Realism, and she's also the editor and co-founder of the journal Resilience, a journal of the environmental humanities. She has published over 20 articles and book chapters in prestigious journals such as PMLA, Science, American Literary History, and American Literature. And right now she's completing a book about garbage and waste, which I'm looking forward to learning more about tonight. With Elizabeth Mazzolini, she co-edited Histories of the Dust Heap, Waste, Material Cultures, Social Justice, and with Jeffrey Cohen, she co-edited the recent Cambridge Companion to the Environmental Humanities, just published last year. The title of Professor Foote's presentation today is Thinking at the End of the World, the work of the environmental humanities. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the HRC and VCU tonight, Stephanie Foote.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm so grateful to you for being here and to Christina for inviting me. And I'm so happy to be Christina's guest. I have been amazed and impressed by her mind and her imagination since the day I met her. In fact, since the day I read her application to go to graduate school, I knew she would be at the center of the humanities, and she is. I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from land that includes ancestral territories of the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois Six Nations, and many other indigenous people. And I also want to acknowledge that the sale of land tracts from over 30 separate tribes helped to fund the establishment of West Virginia University as a land-grant institution. I'm also mindful that I'm addressing you on Zoom, which requires an enormous amount of energy and an infrastructure built in part using rare earths, the extraction of which causes enormous degradation to the world's most impoverished people. I also realized that my talk has a really boring title, Thinking at the End of the World, the Work of the Environmental Humanities, and it could have been called any number of things. What is the environmental humanities, or are we doomed? What the environmental humanities tells us, or the environmental humanities, who cares what English professors think about environmental crisis? Has there ever been a moment when people have thought that they were thinking at the end of one kind of world or on the precipice of another? Everyone always thinks that, but I hope in this talk to tell you what the environmental humanities is and where it came from. And I hope too to make a really persuasive argument that it does matter what the humanities has to say about environmental crisis, and to make a further brief about what environmental humanities can do to help ameliorate the current crisis, and perhaps even to strengthen the way we imagine the work of and the value of the humanities going forward. As I speak to you, you are no doubt aware that systemic anthropogenic climate change has effects that seem both sudden, but which are in fact a product of long-term, slow-moving, planetary, atmospheric, and local changes. We think we are in crisis, but the problems are chronic. The results of this chronic climate degradation now seem to be everywhere in the news. Indeed, they are so constantly in front of our eyes that it can be hard to even register how many of them are happening all at once, even in the US, much less across the globe. Some of these events are obvious and have left their mark on the landscape. Can I have slide 2? As well as leaving traces in the water, air, and soil. Can you go back one? Thank you. That is actually a picture of not far from where I live and work in West Virginia. And as you can see, it is a photo of mountaintop removal, a form of coal mining that, just as its name says, shears off the top of mountains. And as you can see, it is not just what's visible. There was a leak from into the Elk River in which chemicals used in mountaintop coal removal are now in the water and soil all around me. Some events are emergency events like wildfires in the western part of the country. Next slide, please. Which, despite their unpredictability in the moment, are now so common and systemically predictable that they require publicly available and constantly updated data like this. Next slide. You can consult this map if you live in California to see how intense the fires are and how quickly they're spreading. But even wildfires are the result of a longer term cycle of droughts that are in part due to anthropogenic climate change. I grabbed this actually a couple days ago. And of course, the images of extraordinary climate events like superstorms and hurricanes that can decimate entire towns and regions. Next slide, please. Like the current flood in Mississippi, also expose years of degraded infrastructure that in turn exposes the class and race injustice that has informed the very industrialization that accelerated climate change in the first place. So given these images, which are on the one hand all too common and on the other cannot actually depict the systems that underwrite the events that they represent, what exactly can the humanities do to make them more legible? Especially given that the image of the humanities is not so much about the image you're looking at as this next image. Ooh, wonderful. This, by the way, nope, image got left out. Well, it was at somebody's office that looked like a humanities professor, and it's no office known to any humankind. But I showed it because you can't see it, because the popular imagination is that we do our work alone in beautiful offices without much interaction with the world. The question is what specifically the humanities, especially the environmental humanities, can offer in the face of a world in crisis, a world that is in crisis importantly in so many different ways, place by place, location by location, along already existing axes of race, gender, class, ethnicity, and region. I want to make a case for how environmental humanities thinks not just about the world, but about something we might call world building, how it teaches us to think about how we got to the world we share, and how we've also come to simultaneously inhabit such different worlds from each other, how the environmental humanities can imagine the deep structure of those worlds, and how it can teach us to think about possible futures by inhabiting the edges between those worlds that meet and overlap in unpredictable ways. I think the environmental humanities can do a number of important things. First, it can, using humanistic methods we are all very familiar with if we work in history or English or political theory or communications or gender studies, like archival research or close reading or even book history. Those methods can trace the line that links any number of crises in the moment to the longer, buried, or repressed histories that underwrite and have helped to cause that crisis or event. Humanists are really good at thinking structurally because they think about narrative and the way that it structures experience. Second, environmental humanities can have an effect by embracing genuine collaborative work, genuine interdisciplinary work. And by saying collaborative and interdisciplinary, I don't mean the way that we simply use that term all the time. And I don't mean that we use all the same methods or even have the same goal or share the same object of analysis. I mean something more like thinking with. If we can say anything about the environmental humanities, it's not just that it thinks about environmental matters in any way that a scholar will define them. What it does best is to think with objects and events, humans and non-humans, to find a way to see stories that have not been recognized yet about the complex structures that mediate our relationship to the overlapping worlds that we inhabit but don't always share. Thinking with means thinking instrumentally. What does the world look like, for example, from the perspective of garbage? But also what new stories about value emerge in a world structured by waste. So let me start here with the most basic definition of the field. My collaborator, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, and I have argued that the challenge of environmental humanities has been to find ways to address what we call the ongoing volatility of the relationship between ideology, ecology, and culture in a world in which natural resources are disappearing. We argued that the field takes as its object of analysis, no matter if the method is literary, philosophical, historical, the evolving relationships between the non-human and human world, and that it pays attention to how those relationships have structured political events, aesthetic production, and perhaps more importantly, a host of ordinary ways of inhabiting often contradictory worlds, like clean streets in a dying empire, or lush green grass made greener by the poison that we use. This is a very capacious and a deliberately capacious definition, and we use that to structure the Cambridge Companion to Environmental Humanities. And there are shorter definitions that are punchier, so you can consult any number of books. And actually, you don't have to write any of this. If I say a name, you don't have to write it down because I have made a bibliography of everyone that I was thinking about or reference in this talk that I will drop in the comments so that you can have it. If that's a working definition of the field, though, it would not be complete unless we had some definitions of its key terms. So in this talk, I want to walk you through 4 things relatively quickly. First is a discussion over what we even call the period we live in and why we call it that. The second is a set of competing histories about how the environmental humanities entered a larger public discussion of environmental issues and what kinds of stories it chose to align itself with and how we can make it align with different kinds of stories. When I talk about this, I'll also talk about some of the biggest conceptual issues that are now structuring the field. And then in the third part, I want to give you a discussion of how those conceptual issues structure humanities work. So I'm going to show you a few images and examples of public environmental humanities projects and talk a little bit about my own work on garbage to show you what thinking with means instead of just thinking about as a foundational methodological principle. And finally, I want to close by making some suggestions about how the humanities traditional disciplines can work within universities and with the help of universities to have a broader reach and impact around environmental matters. So here's the first part. What are we talking about when we talk about this moment of increased alertness around environmental issues? What are the key terms and why do they matter? Most of us by now are used to seeing the word Anthropocene in news articles, scholarly articles, and public opinion pieces. And you probably know this, but that term comes from scientists Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer, who proposed it in the year 2000. And 2 years later, Crutzen summarized what their argument about using the Anthropocene really was. He wrote, "It seemed appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present, in many ways, human-dominated geological epoch, supplementing the Holocene, the warm period of the past 10 to 12 millennia. The Anthropocene could be said to have started in the latter part of the 18th century when analyses of air trapped in polar ice showed the beginning of growing global concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane. This date happens to also coincide, he says, with James Watt's design of the steam engine in 1784. Crutzen and Stormer and other scientists are very aware that the Anthropocene has been caused by only a tiny number of humans on the planet. And as far as the logic of linking the term to the rise of industrialization in the latter part of the 18th century, the name seems fine. Indeed, it has actually stuck in ways that I find really surprising. It's general, it's straightforward, and it seems to do the work of underscoring that humans are responsible for climate change. But there are some really good reasons to quarrel with this term and to try and find another name. It's not like any of these names are going to stick, although people have tried, but as an exercise in origin stories, and we love origin stories. This is why people keep going to see Marvel Universe films. Origin stories helps humanists to try and figure out how some ways of narrating complicated historical events that lead to an outcome in one way and not another actually allow us to forget some historical forces, often without even knowing we're doing it, and prioritize others that we're used to thinking about. So here are some of the other names that EH scholars have thought of to name what Crutzen and Stormer understood as geologic era. And I'm going to skip over here all the debates about where to locate the golden spike, which is a point in the stratigraphic record where humans can be seen to have indelibly changed the geographic record. So I'm going to tell you about three alternate terms. First, the capitalist scene. This is scholar Jason Moore's preferred designation for the era. And he, along with a host of other really excellent, super smart scholars like Andreas Malm, chooses it because it directly names the underlying cause of climate change, the unregulated turn toward a market economy in which all of nature and everything about human life is assessed for its extractive market value under capital. For him, the utility of calling our era the capitalist scene is that it accounts for an economic system that has become a biopolitical system. No, you are not supposed to see slides yet, but you will in a second. Enfolding all life within it. It also allows us to see the uneven benefits accrued and distributed by a relatively small amount of people in that system. And unsurprisingly, it allows Moore to think about the geologic and planetary impact of human activity way beyond the industrial era. And we know this because he started publishing about the capitalist scene in the Journal of Peasant Studies. So he locates way, way back. So that's one term, one that extends the Anthropocene beyond the industrial era, but doesn't just focus on the human. Here's another term, Plantationocene. This term is linked to capitalist scene because it figures an economic, social, and political system of exploitation as the driver of climate change, but it is especially attuned to the racial hierarchies that subtend this system. Linking it to an idea of the plantation allows us to think about the rise of an economic system of land use that relied on settler colonial logics and the homogenization of nature as a particularly immiserating extractive zone. What we get from saying Plantationocene is not just the reminder that capitalism operated by market value, but that the system itself always was a racial project. It depended on the continual exploitation and enslavement of people of color and indigenous people across the globe. This is a term that pays attention to a very complex story that we can really easily lose if we talk about just human-centered climate change. It assigns responsibility and obligation differently than if we just say Anthropocene. And here's one last term, one that will never catch on because no one can say it or spell it. And it's the Cthulhucene, which is Donna Haraway's term. And she uses this term to bring attention to the multi-species element of the world we live in. To say we are repeating the errors of using anthropos to prioritize only human actors in any discussion of the current crisis. We live, she argues, in a vast, complicated network with other beings. And when we tell stories about climate change that neglect our enmeshment with them, we operate using a limited idea of agency, life, and autonomy. And thus we risk repeating the very hierarchies that produced the imperial expansion that we are living through now and seeing the effects in mega superstorms, fires, extraction, impoverishment, and so on. The value of this term, like so much else that is valuable in her work, is that it asks people to remember that what we are arguing about is not just the fate of the social actor in a dying world. We're arguing about the fate of any unknown number of living things that are tied to our fates, but not determined by them. And I tell you these stories, and they're probably known to you, about how scholars have quarreled and attempted to refine and redefine the very terms under which we apprehend this era. Not to bore you, and I hope we haven't done that, and I will show you more slides, but to make a pitch, that humanists are good at the project of finding out lost histories, which means that we're also good at finding now lost but once possible futures. Anyone who's ever been in a seminar knows that sometimes it seems like this sort of exercise is splitting hairs or fiddling while Rome burns. And it can seem like an enormous privilege to spend our time arguing over the utility of the term Anthropocene, especially when even now, the Pew Center has shown data that a full 20% of Americans are still not entirely persuaded that there is such a thing as climate change. It's not immediately clear the stakes that the arguments around Anthropocene or Plantationocene or Capitalistocene will have any impact on what we most care about, policy change or legislative fixes or economic incentives. I sympathize with this, but I also believe that it's wrong to think that these debates aren't critical. It's frustrating to watch them sometimes and to be an academic in the humanities, but when we have these arguments, what we're really doing is reminding ourselves that the very way we describe an historical teleology operates on an axis to include and exclude social actors who are often the most affected and whose stories can really quickly be forgotten. It's correct to say the Anthropocene is about human changes to the climate. It is a mistake, as the great scholar Sylvia Wynter reminds us, to believe that the category of the rights-bearing human has always been equally available to everyone on Earth. What we're doing when we're proposing new terms is trying to make a pitch for what kind of method we care about, to think about how other key terms like nature, culture, autonomy, gender, or race constitute, even in their silences, the kind of world that we have ended up living in. But if calling into question the very definition of what counts as human, and calling into question nature for that matter, means that we're fully in the realm of the humanities, both in the splitting of hairs over titles and over the real impact of how names can make visible and invisible different social actors and events, I want to redirect us here to offer a different way to think about the emergence and utility of environmental humanities. So this is part 2, how we can think about how EH scholars were thinking with something other than scholarship as they began to invent this field. I want to give you a sense of the emergence of EH as a collaborative scholarly enterprise by looking not at its academic evolution, although that is actually kind of a fascinating story, but at how world-building activist enterprises informed it. So this is a story about how an academic discipline emerged in tandem with activism on the ground that made the possibilities of thinking at scale and across temporalities and around the work of justice possible. And this is a way of thinking about EH and how it recovers lost worlds and imagined future worlds. This is a vision that will be really familiar to you if you work in anything like gender studies or queer theory, because it's a really similar story to how queer theory gained its current ascension in the academy. Those of you in queer theory will doubtless remember the watershed years of the late 80s and 90s. I might be the oldest person here, but I remember those years, when post-structuralist theory was ascending in the academy, and some of the most serious and lively debates in gender theory were happening all the time in classrooms, in quads, in dorms. All we tend to remember from that now is the endurance of Judith Butler's gender performativity, an idea that still has a lot of traction in queer theory, and it's wonderful, right? But what's most useful to remember about that moment, let's call it around 1990, is that the real energy of that work was happening in conjunction with on-the-ground activism. We tend to think of and teach critical theory and gender theory as though it's an airless academic line of questions. There's absolutely no doubt that at the moment of its emergence, queer theory engaged and learned from politics and theorizing on the ground of activism. Gender trouble, to take that example, and the idea of performativity took their brief not just from the reams of philosophers with whom Butler was arguing, but from the activism that rose through organizations like ACT UP. And that is a debt that Butler is very clear about in their work. We can say a lot about that. We can say that in this history, as in any other, there were problems of race and class. But what I want to point out here is that the discipline we understand as gender studies and queer theory and queer studies was not simply developed as a natural offshoot of reading a lot of Foucault, even though we did that, and he himself was an activist, or as an offshoot of debates in other areas of academic study, which themselves emerged from activist backgrounds like gender studies. The enormously generative and catalyzing work in queer theory and queer history followed on-the-ground activism, and it took its lead from on-the-ground work, and at its best, it never left it behind. The ordinariness of queer life, even if it had not been visible to authorities as anything other than a crime against nature, was especially important. And I want to argue that really the same thing happened to catalyze environmental humanities. And this is why the genealogy of EH should rightly start with activists who are working on justice issues. They were pointing out that we do not all inhabit the same material physical world. They were pointing out that the structure of why some people get to not see that is important to how categories like nature have been imagined in the first place. It's critical when we look at the rise of EH in universities to recognize that there's a standard story about environmental concerns, and it tracks from a love of nature, and everyone always talks about Thoreau here. And it can cover the rise of the national park system and the founding of organizations like the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society and the establishment of the EPA. And this is all really important. And it's often been organized around a version of nature that's very familiar to us. Pristine, glorious, healing, undeveloped, where you go to camp or hike, where you go to get away from it all. But that is a history that is about preservation. And it's highly specific. It applies to only a few people in its affirmative, pleasurable ways. You can actually still see that version of environmental everywhere, in part because it's state-sponsored. Many of the organizations and charities that seek your money and your attention draw on that same logic. They're about preserving and conserving, about protecting, about making sure that things aren't exploited or overdeveloped. But what humanists have done and can do is to point out how many histories were erased, for example, in the making of national parks, how much land was taken from indigenous people, how powerfully white and masculine that one vision of nature is. They can also point out, as the great historian William Cronin has done so elegantly, that the very conception of nature that underwrites this as a pristine wilderness has always been false. There is, he argues, never such a thing in the United States. And he compels us to look at how nature has been overwritten by culture in order to assume its present ideological form. And I'm not telling you that national parks are bad. And I'm not telling you that this version of environmentalism is bad. It had its own activism and its own political ideology, and those things were and still can be very useful. But what I'm saying is, if we think about the environmental humanities only emerging in concert with this one kind of environmental consciousness, we are going to miss some of the most generative work that was happening on the ground. We miss the opportunity to see how the humanities can engage in it. I want to tell you about a couple of those things by way of the great Rob Nixon. Rob Nixon argued in his book, Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, that scholars need to understand how to present stories that happen beyond the range of attention, of normal attention. First, that is about the slowness of unfolding events in climate change. But its second category he's interested in is what he calls, in shorthand, the poor. Part of this is not simply to use immiserated people as victims, to describe what happened to them and how they've suffered, to bring the world's attention to them, but to refocus our attention on how they have fought back, organized, resisted, and in the process of doing that, have reset the terms of how scholars should recognize and link to other ways to think environmentally. So let me be clear here. It is important to find a way to tell the stories of people who have been harmed by environmental disaster. Those stories, as you might guess, are almost always the story of people who have endured other kinds of harms, whether they're harms produced around and through their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their caste, their religion, their socioeconomic status. But what's imperative is to also see their responses outside of our own framework, which as scholars is also often raced and classed and gendered. Poor communities, writes Nixon, have to patch together threadbare alliances against vastly superior military, corporate, and media forces. As such, impoverished rebels can seldom afford to be single-issue activists. Their green commitments are seamed through with other economic and cultural causes as they experience environmental threat, not as a planetary abstraction, but as a set of inhabited risks, some imminent, others obscurely long-term. So I'm going to show you a few responses, on-the-ground responses, that we often don't pay enough attention to and compare them to each other. And I want to emphasize how this might look in practice to link EH and its emergence to a kind of activism. Next slide. In 1991, thank you, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership met and produced Principles of Environmental Justice. We, the people of color, they wrote, gathered together at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our land and communities, do hereby reestablish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world, to ensure environmental justice, to promote economic alternatives, which would also contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and to secure our political, economic, and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples. Do affirm and adopt these principles of environmental justice. And the next 4 slides, I just want to show you some of these principles. They are just stunning, right? And I feel like in conventional academic work, we have not paid enough attention to how amazing it is you just want to see the next 4 slides, there's 17 points, and I wanted you to see them all. It's amazing that this happened, and we need to pay more attention to it. And what the Summit of the People of Color was doing was extending a long tradition of civil rights activism that recognized, for example, that people of color and indigenous people were more likely to live close to toxic dumps and industries. And that's actually phrased wrong. Where they were living is the place where industries felt free to dump toxic waste, is the better way to say that. Their manifesto recognized that human rights are tied to environmental justice. They argued that communities of colors had experienced harms at a greater rate and longer than any other group. This links them to a global fight for justice. The world scientists, in the next slides, I don't know what I ended up doing. These are some world scientists, right? This came out in 1992. It's the World Scientists Warning to Humanity. It was signed by over 1,700 scientists, including 104 Nobel laureates. They did a second warning in 2017 that was published in Bioscience. It's downloaded all the time. And they just did a recent one about 2 years ago, and they wrote a warning to humanity with a list of bullet points. And it looks remarkably similar to the bullet points in the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And it got a lot of airplay in the press, as did the second and third warnings, which I can't remember if I included here. Can you go to another slide? Yeah, here's the third warning, right? And so you can see here that they have been highly influenced by environmental justice strategies in something like the 1991 People of Color Summit. And they argue in their conclusion to mitigate and adapt to climate change while honoring the diversity of humans entails a major transformation in the way our global society functions and interacts with natural ecosystems. These are really similar documents. They come out right around the same time as some really foundational books in environmental humanities, Bill Cronin's Nature's Metropolis or Lawrence Buell's Environmental Imagination. But as historical artifacts, as texts themselves, these manifestos that I showed you demonstrate to us that the work of trying to figure out what was so-called early eco-criticism in the humanities was not new or path-breaking. In fact, what academics were doing when they started thinking about environmental humanities was a little bit belated in its recognition that the endangered world had been endangering some people, hidden from historical accounts much longer than we were willing to once see. So what if they, and not Thoreau, for example, nothing against Thoreau, are the voices we need to return to when we recast the history of the globe or of US literature? What does EH show us if we take an activist intellectual genealogy into account? What do we do with the fact that these artifacts rely on different kinds and forms of authority, different methods of thinking about time, harm, or even what counts as place? What would it mean to posit that the data that EH scholars should be working with includes not only the stories and texts of people whose land has been poisoned or stolen, but the data that the world scientists, now over 2,000 scientists, have signed onto these letters, and they include tons and tons of charts and graphs in this. What does it mean if we engage with them? Humanists are surprisingly good at engaging with models like that, and yet we rarely let ourselves do it, to bring an activist tradition and a data-driven tradition together. And this is a part where I tell you how much good work has come out of recognizing that activist tradition and thinking with it, not just about it. So just to be clear, my point in showing you these documents came out around the same time that the field started to get its academic legs, was to suggest a genealogy of the field as intimately tied always to justice struggles, in part because while on-the-ground activism seemed to happen just in the moment, it was already doing the kind of powerful counter-narrative that wanted to unseat a longer official history of what we mean when we say, for example, nature or literature or human, exactly the kind of work that humanists picked up on when they began to address environmental humanities. This genealogy, activist rather than just academic, has shaped so much current work in the field. Right now, scholarship in EH is organized around some key terms or clusters that also are invested in producing counter narratives to the official story of how the natural world has been shaped through and by culture. These clusters give us a way to think not simply about the scope of EH, but the different ways humanities disciplines frame out arguments and can potentially work together. The field is interested in materiality. What's the role of matter historically and textually? How has it been made to speak or exert agency? Scale and time. How can we coordinate the long history of something like agriculture or extraction or industrialization with the epiphenomenon of a text or a poem or a painting or storm? Embodiment and biopolitics. How is the body itself always already enmeshed with the material world, registering like a text the sedimented toxicities around us? Affect theory. What and how do individual feelings contribute to the larger structure of ideology about such things as extinction or resource extraction? There are more clusters, but I think you can see they're not all that different in the methodology they project to the ways that we read now, because they're things and events to read with rather than simply things to read. They open the humanities to a broad consideration of all the ways we mediate our relationship to a toxic world. I have so much left to go. Should I just start skipping stuff? Because I would really rather hear from you than from me.
Keep going.
No, keep going. All right. You can find people in EH working on anime, film and television, food scarcity, food sovereignty, extinction, endangerment, affect, grief, nostalgia, solastalgia, science fiction, cli-fi, petromelancholia, geology, on feeling stuck, on feeling unstuck, on fighting for justice, or even what I work on, which is garbage and waste. Just I hope you all start writing on garbage because it is mind-blowing. The discipline is now broken into subfields like energy humanities, extractive humanities, blue humanities, elemental humanities, infrastructural humanities, and dozens more. And all of them share in common a way to rethink how human social actors have been intentionally and unintentionally entangled in more than human worlds. What the best of them do is try to figure out ways to imagine the structure of thinking in the face of powerful structuring forces that do not have their own humanities-based language. That is to say, they find ways to bring different narrative frames and different temporalities into conversation. But how do you do that? And this is part 3, where I show you a few collaborative projects that are about thinking with. Okay. We go to the next. Yes, okay. This is an amazing thing. Now, this is grant funded, and it has a center, and it is doing a zillion projects, and it engages with undergraduate students and with community members. And it is Bethany Wiggins, who is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. She founded the Penn Program for Environmental Humanities Projects, and they do all kinds of things, right? They go out into the community and they talk about what toxic neighborhoods are. They do collaborative research across the arts and sciences. They go into high schools in the city of Philadelphia. They try to link up to other places on the globe. They are making a living archive by collecting the stories of people who live by toxic sites in Philadelphia. And I think I have a slide that shows a little bit of that. Yeah, this is one of the projects that Professor Wiggin has been working on. It's From Petrol to Plastics project. And 2 undergraduate interns in architectures and material sciences and architecture and urban studies were able to go out into the communities and build and establish long relationships. Like, you can't just go out and interview people. You have to build relationships. You have to make them feel heard. You have to help them see that the university is not exploiting you. And they've created an archive of digital projects that can be added to, that can be discussed in the community, and that on many occasions, Bethany has used to address city planners thinking about legislation. But that's not the only kind of project you can do, right? That's a big grant funded project. There's a lot of money at the University of Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of money from the Mellon Foundation. The next slide is this. This is a project. Oh no.
Sorry, I'll get back to it.
No,
That's-
no,
that's
that's
my,
okay. That's it. That's the one, line 6B, Citizens Blog. This is a project by a great scholar named Jeff Insko, who is a 19th century Americanist. And he has created a blog that he works on all the time. It's a public, outward-facing blog that actually he invites scholars to contribute to. And it is basically about the fact that the Enbridge Corporation, the Line 6B pipeline, was going right through his backyard. So he decided that he would look every single thing up about the corporation, about its documents, about what they were doing to indigenous lands, about how they were violating indigenous treaties. And he would put every single thing up and analyze it in a publicly available fashion on this blog. It is a massive amount of work, and it's very much like how scholars usually do their work. They assemble evidence, they put it up, they explain it, and they analyze it. But this work has really seen Jeff Insko, again, such a major intellect, such an amazing person, has really seen him go toe to toe with people at the Enbridge Corporation. The next slide is this. You think to yourself, how do you do a collaborative project? Well, there are dozens of publicly available maps. This is a map of Superfund sites around your university. Virginia actually has around 35 Superfund sites. You guys live very close to some serious garbage dumps and Superfund sites. What would it mean to make a project that does something with this kind of data? For whom could you make it meaningful? What is the structure of knowledge humanists would have to be involved with to make something like this publicly important? What stories about land and place are revealed even when you look at or talk about a map? What does it mean to think with a map, with a place? How is that place connecting you to a globe through the circulation of garbage and toxins? What does it say about our implication in the disasters that seem to overwhelm us? And this is the last part, and I'm going to skip over my own project on garbage just to say, these are some things I think universities can do, and amazingly, you guys are already doing them. One, we have to make the case to administrators that all collaborative work is at least as difficult as single authored work, and often harder. We have to make the case to administrators that the printed artifact is not the sum of humanities knowledge. Syllabi, talks, monuments, walking tours, public projects, digital projects, blogs like Jeff Insko's blog are scholarship. They count as scholarship because they are ways of historicizing and reframing 1,000 data points into a story that reveals a meaningful set of ideas about how complicated our relationship with the world is. Two, we need a humanities lab, and you have one, which frees us up to collaborate. Collaborating is very difficult. It takes a lot of time, a huge amount of planning time, and it is structured. You have to be able to develop a project that can, on the one hand, be open-ended, and on the other hand, be done in a certain amount of time. It has to be built, it has to have an aim, it has to have a goal, and people actually have to listen to how other scholars think about their expertise. And this involves learning to talk to scientists who, from my experience, are dying to talk to humanists, but don't quite understand what we do. And that's the last thing. We need to learn how to tell people what it is we do. We hear at universities all the time, you need to account for yourselves. And they mean that accounting often in nickels and dimes. Why should we pay humanists to do what they do? But actually, we need to learn to say that we ourselves, our great skill as humanists is to account for partial pieces of data and stories that have as of yet been unheard. We account for those by putting them next to each other and allowing them to speak about something that we have not yet seen before. The projects that I showed you, and there are dozens more out there. I actually wish I'd given this whole talk on all these weird projects, are just a handful that are currently trying to get off the ground. They're beautiful, they're persuasive. They will not change the world. They will not save the world, but they are in the world, and they are trying to make thinking into a shared project that's durational, historical, and that pushes the end of their small part of the world just a little further off by recognizing that the humanities have methods for world making and not just world critiquing. Thank you for coming to my talk. And thank you again, Christina, smartest person in the world. Sorry to dump the super fun site stuff on you. I'm always completely fascinated because I work on garbage about how much garbage is around us at all times.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is so eloquently put, and I know there are already some questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder to the audience, please continue to post your questions. And before we move on, I'm dying to hear more about your garbage project. Tell us more and show us the way. There's also.
You know what? I promise you, what about this? I will send you the introduction to that garbage book. It's in process and you can do whatever you want with it. But
Fair enough.
Looking at municipal solid waste, which is the garbage that we throw away every day. And I'm trying to talk about how it now circulates so quickly globally that it has outstripped our theories about how to value and devalue it. And that's one of the reasons why things like hoarding and collecting produce so much fascination, and why garbage itself makes us so anxious, right? Mm-hmm. It's the first way we have of both understanding, but also repressing that our daily life ties us intimately to the lives of people we will never see or know across the globe. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of boring. But I like
no, it's not actually. It's quite relevant, not just to the field, but to all of us as humanists. And I just want to give a shout out before I forget to David Berenger, who is here with us, of former Virginia Humanities. And I forgot in my opening remarks, because I was so excited to get to introduce you, Stephanie, to thank Virginia Humanities for sponsoring our speaker series this year. So thank you so much, Virginia Humanities. Keep sponsoring talks in the humanities. We are very grateful for that. And with this, let's go to some of the questions. One of them about religion, and I'm going to try to summarize this a little bit. I think this is back to your point about origin stories and how the environmental humanities and humanities in general are helping us retell those origin stories. So the anonymous attendee is asking, is the field of environmental humanities focusing at all on the influence of the book of Genesis and the Judeo-Christian world? Is there any connection, or is the book of Genesis, the viewer asks, part of the problem? Is it the root of the problem?
Oh wow, that's an intense question. I just don't know. I do know that there are religious studies scholars working in environmental humanities doing some of the most fascinating work, trying to think about what drives things. Like, there's a wonderful scholar whose name I'm forgetting, and I'll put her on the bibliography I share with you, who actually talks about, does a study of back to the landers and homesteaders in the 60s. He tries to figure out how they used a religious or spiritual sensibility to move them to a sense of nature that is actually much more in ways they didn't see at the time, much more Eastern. And it's really fascinating material. But I love that question. And I hope it doesn't sound like a cop-out, that I want to think.
Well, we have sorry to interrupt, our colleague who is in 18th century British studies, Rivka Swenson, posted a comment in the chat, not in the Q&A, trying to explicate the question a little bit, saying that they mean the translation in KJV that says man has dominion over the world and animals, versus the Hebrew version, man as a kind of steward or wise caretaker.
Yes. And now I see the question. And that is I love, you, Professor Swenson, you probably know this, but the 18th century British scholars and especially medievalists and 18th and 19th centuries were doing some of the first best work in literary eco-criticism, because they were interested in questions exactly like this. And so if you read in the American context, Lawrence Buell's first book, I think it is called, it's in my bibliography for you. Is it The Endangered World or something like that? But he talks about what it means to have inherited a translation that immediately overlays a highly problematic gender system on nature and culture. And there have been some great feminist philosophers, environmental humanities. Stacey Alamo's first book was about this, and Belle Plumwood talks about this. And I think it is incredibly productive for the way that it thinks about gender ideology that goes so deep that it's actually hard to start to locate it, and how rich capitalism saw that ideology in its exploitation of gender, right? In the ways that you can think about tilling the land and being a steward and its masculinity. But I thank you for that question. It's really good.
I think it's partly because I did not read the entire question. I think I skipped a few sentences, which really reduced the complexity of the question. I think the audience member was asking about this idea of the in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God gave men dominion over all the creatures, right? So the implication, the world was created for us to use, right? Which is antithetical to many native spiritual traditions. And so I see Peter Utz, who also posted another comment about religion, also involved in this debate. He says in two ways: by promoting pro-natalism and by promoting the naive belief that God will fix all problems, right? And we'll go to heaven. Anyway, the dominion over the world is another problem, indeed. So thank you so much for this direction. I'd like to switch, unless you would like to chime in, Stephanie.
No, I do love this though. I always highly recommend Jason Moore's work. He's the guy who talked about the capitalist scene, because he is really trying to trace these intricate ideologies, like how, like, why did the rise of industrialization get yoked to the firming up of religion? Why did this manifest in this incredible exploitation of people and land? And in part, he traces it through capitalism's voracious appetite for any ideology that can serve it, right? Like, it will make use of that.
Yeah. My students and I were talking about your introduction last night, and they were surprised that, I mean, perhaps we know this in the back of our minds, but the US is a larger consumer of energy in the world, right?
Oh, good. Yes.
And I think this really opens up all sorts of questions about about the world we inhabit, and we could no longer recuperate. And I'd like to move on to two more questions. Our colleague Charmaine Jones asked, thanks you for this thoughtful presentation and appreciates the emphasis on the relationship between theory and activism. So the question she asks is, how does this relationship inform pedagogy? And I really liked your examples from the Penn student project. What kinds of ethical considerations should inform our teaching approach, assignments, to keep these concerns at the center of the classroom? Thanks, Charmaine.
That is a fantastic question, because it becomes really easy. When I teach environmental humanities to undergrad classes, I usually teach it organized around garbage. And, the first thing that happens is, first of all, I can show them, you can publicly find all these different maps where people, I live in West Virginia, right? There's a lot of like empty holes in the ground, and there's a lot of corporate waste. There's a tremendous feeling of first guilt that is almost operatic, right? It just keeps centering the subject. And so I do try to find assignments that get them to decenter themselves. And so, but also I talk a lot about complicity, right? And I talk a lot about what it means to be complicit in a system that benefits you, and then to wake up and realize that no matter what your private personal beliefs are, you are actually still enjoying all of these benefits, especially if you're able-bodied and you're white and you're cisgender and you're middle class. And so that becomes a topic of conversation all the time. And so, but I do try and create exercises that get them over the kind of any kind of white savior complex, right? Like I'm gonna go out and fix everything, and I'm gonna join the Peace Corps and blah blah blah, to say something like world building can be as small as you figuring out that that complaining about homelessness because of the garbage left on the streets is actually a profound classist and racist act, right? Like you can do something here in your town. And so often our assignments are map this block. Where do you see garbage, and what kind of garbage is it? Right? Is this garbage people coming out of bars, or is this garbage from people barely surviving? Learn to look and to see your own complicity in it. And I will admit, it's often really hard, because you end up spending a lot of time talking about what complicity really is. It's difficult. Absolutely. But I love the question, because I actually think we don't talk a lot about pedagogy anymore in the environmental humanities, and it's too bad, because that is probably the fastest, easiest, and best way that we publish our scholarship. We share it with people in the classroom.
I really loved your example of going into the community and establishing relationships, right? Building trust.
Yes,
and then, doing the extractive knowledge work, right?
Exactly.
There's another question, and then I'll come back to Natasha's question. Natasha is a colleague from the College of Engineering. But let me go to Aidan Lears' question, which is connected to Charmaine, in the sense that it brings us back to pedagogy, narrative, and stories. That the question is about the place of poetry and or non-representational meaning making in the environmental humanities. If you have any thoughts.
There is, I actually work on narrative. I work on novels. Mm-hmm. There is amazing work in poetry and non-representational forms. And there's like a little bit of a push and pull in some of the fine arts, for example, and in people who are doing poetry, to think about, can you have an environmental message that is comprehensible if you're not doing representational art, right? Which is, if you make art out of garbage, should it look like an elephant right? So we can talk about endangered species. This kind of argument happens all the time with people doing garbage art. The place of poetry, though, I actually love this question because part of what environmental humanities does is try to make us see what is right in front of our faces differently, as though it were strange. And I feel like poetry itself can help. Certainly my students do that. Like when I give them poetry, they suddenly realize that virtually every novel proceeds, even the very best ones, proceed by virtue of cliche or genre, right? But a deep kind of experimentation with something out of place, the rhythm of language, I think can actually help them in the task of seeing the world anew, which is kind of what you ask students to do in environmental humanities classes. Like, you don't want to data dump on them because it's scary. You want to teach them a habit of experiencing the hidden histories that inform every object that they take for granted and the systems that make it possible. But I love that question, and I wish I knew more about it.
That's a great answer. We were having this conversation last night in class, Stephanie, and we're talking about the patterns we identify as literature scholars. And we read some of Leanne Simpson's poetry, Anshnabeck poet, and that there's an interesting way to relate the ways in which we see patterns in poetry to how we see patterns in environmental studies, and how this methodological turn is actually something to value about the method of EH. I have one more question, and I'm sorry, we are getting very close to the end. I think we are a little bit over time. One last question from Natasha Lewinsky. As an engineer, she says she's curious if folks in environmental humanities have examined how humans choose to prioritize the value of clean air versus clean water versus clean land, right? So you talked about waste and how waste goes somewhere, right? And it's not reused and repurposed.
I am so glad to have this question because, yes, they talk about it all the time, and it's there's a kind of logical fallacy, right? Which is, if you can see it, right, you know it's dirty. So if you can see dirty water, you know it has to be ameliorated. And somehow there have been people in environmental communications who have looked at the fact that people can see smog and they can see litter on the ground and they can see dirty water, but it is actually very hard to convince people that most toxins will be invisible to them, right? So there's a kind of predisposition or a illogical bias toward what's visible. And I think in part that actually has to do with people are overwhelmed by the sheer amount that they don't know when it gets down to something like the level of thinking about chemicals. You can say something like, well, don't use Roundup, right? Roundup is banned in California. Roundup is bad. But if you were to say, these are all the things in Roundup, most people, including me, actually not know what they are. And there are some fantastic memoirs, and they're thought about as toxic memoirs by people who have experienced what they understand to be environmental poisoning, and probably the mother of all those, without knowing that, without readers really knowing she was doing it, was Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, who, when she wrote that and later went to testify before the United States Congress, was slowly dying of breast cancer that she assumed, probably accurately, was partially catalyzed by environmental problems. And now there are lots of toxic memoirs where people try and talk about this. Stacey Alema, who's a wonderful critic, has done beautiful work talking about why the memoir form has somehow managed to allow people to realize that toxicity, that prioritizing air and water was possibly not such a great thing to do, right? Instead of thinking about something like, these are all interlocking systems that we have to pay attention to, and that our body is porous, and we are enmeshed with this, whether we know it or not. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. Should we take one last question, or are we at time? There's a question about public health. I'm not sure we have time for that. And it goes back to your example from Philadelphia. Alton says, I'm hearing a lot of public health principles and things of that nature in your description in terms of Superfund sites and their cleanup. How do you use public health tools when working with communities? Or I guess, how can we use them or to deal with Superfund sites?
For me, I am not in public health. And so when I talk about garbage, I'm actually, I'm talking about the way that the idea of waste and garbage structures narratives about how we explain what we value and what we ignore and what we throw away and what we keep. The Penn Project, as an example of an environmental humanities public project, does work with public health principles. And one of the things that I've really learned from talking to Bethany up at Penn is that you cannot just use those principles, right? Like there's always we always see that at the end of the day, there are a lot of overlaps between, some of the things that happen in social sciences and some of the things that happen in humanities, but we actually have to be really careful with that kind of expertise. And we have to invite, what I've learned from her is you have to invite everybody to the table. You can't just say, oh, I love this public health principle, I'm going to use it. You really have to work with public health people. And they have to work with environmental humanists. So that this is what I meant at the end when I said collaboration is hard work. And the hardest work of all is the planning of it, because most of the planning is, I don't really understand what everyone else does, and they don't understand what I do. And we do have to get really good at explaining not just what our commitments and our tools are, but how shareable they are, right? And sometimes they're not so shareable. Sometimes they are, but I appreciate that question. And I really encourage everybody to look at this beautiful thing that Bethany has made at Penn. There are lots of great public humanities, environmentally themed projects, but these are the two I wanted to show you, Jeff's and Bethany's, but really look at them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I apologize. We ended up going a little bit over time, but thank you so much for staying with us and for taking the extra questions. I'm so grateful for your time, and I thank you for being here. Thanks to all of you in the audience. Again, a big shout out to Virginia Humanities, our department.
Thank you, Virginia.
The College of Humanities and Sciences, of course, and the Office of Vice President for Research. We are, Stephanie, you'll be happy to know that we are actually communicating what we are doing, and we're trying to do that hard work of, educating our administrators. And so we've been fortunate to have funding. And a recording of this event, I just wanted to let everyone know, will be posted on our website. I'd like to mention that our first event in the Meet VCU Authors will happen next Monday on September 12th at noon. Also on Zoom, we'll be welcoming Professor Kai Bosworth, Assistant Professor in the School of World Studies at VCU, and this year HRC Residential Fellow, who will talk about his recent book, just published a couple of months ago, Pipeline Populism, Grassroots Environmentalism in the 21st Century. And we look forward to seeing many of you in person on September the 16th at the ICA to celebrate the humanities. And there's a link Rani can post in the chat. We hope to see many of you and your students at these and future events. Thank you so much, Professor Stephanie Foote. Thank you all for spending this time with us and for supporting the humanities. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Thank you all.